Greetings everyone, this is Rambling Collector, back here with another Warhammer 40,000 book review for all of you today. And this one is not going to be an omnibus review like the last couple of videos have been. This one will be a simple novel review, but one of a very famous Astra Militarum regiment, that being the Death Korps of Krieg. Hence the title of this particular novel, that being Krieg by Steve Lyons. Let's talk about it. So, this particular novel has been on my to-read list for a while when it comes to Warhammer stuff, mostly because of the regiment that it talks about, the Death Korps of Krieg, which this novel in particular shines a massive spotlight on. Both their past as well as their present, how they came to be, and how they operate in the modern-day Imperium of Man. Now, the funny thing about this particular novel is that it takes place within two time periods, and it keeps drifting back between the present and the past, where it starts in Millennium 40, all the way to after the Great Rift. And this essentially covers two major events, the Siege of High Arathron in the modern day, and in the past, the Krieg Civil War. Because the Death Korps of Krieg didn't just pop up out of nowhere. They came as a result of their homeworld, Krieg, rebelling against the Imperium, trying to secede from it. And as a result, one of their most famous military commanders, Colonel Jurden, an icon both in Imperium history, but especially in Krieg's history, chose to lead the army against his commanding officers, his leaders, essentially against his entire homeworld, which tried to secede. Now, for this one, it was a massive war of attrition, because while Colonel Jurden had control of one of the major hive cities on Krieg, it was essentially one city against an entire planet. That was essentially cut off from the Imperium, no supplies, no backup, nothing. This was the Colonel's job to fix. And it wound up turning Krieg, by the end of it, into a blasted wasteland as of the effects of nuclear warfare. Essentially, he set off ancient weapons from the Dark Age of technology across the entire world of Krieg, which turned it into a blasted wasteland after causing the deaths of so many crops, causing an acid rain to rain down on the planet, turning it into what it is today, a death world, but one that produces thousands upon thousands of soldiers that are willing to fight and die to atone for their sins, all of whom are skilled for the most toxic environments across the Imperium. They are sent to some of the most dangerous war zones with high casualty rates and little to no chance of victory. Yet they do so with fervor to repent their sins of their homeworld. Meanwhile, in the modern day, this one siege battle occurs within the Octarius War, one of the biggest and bloodiest moments in Warhammer history, primarily because this involves the Imperium trying to close off this sector of space, which contains not only the Tyranid Hive Fleet Leviathan, but a massive army of orcs. So not only do you have orcs and Tyranids fighting each other and growing in strength and size, but you have the Imperium trying to kind of, I want to say, quarantine this area, and yet they are doing so with massive casualties and a very slim chance of doing so. As a matter of fact, the upcoming 10th edition shows the fallout of this, where the Tyranids are going to be coming back in a massive way. But the ones on the front lines were always the Krieg. But this one covers the Siege of High Arathron, which shows a Acadian regiment having to work alongside the Death Korps. And this is where the strength of this novel comes in. It shows a major focus on the brutality as well as agonizing slowness of siege warfare, because the orcs have taken this city and they are trying to take it back. But it shows how the Death Korps operates, building up trenches, trying to constantly shell the enemy, to keep them occupied, keep them busy. And it shows how back then trench warfare, if we look back at our modern history, trench warfare was hell on earth because of the agonizing slowness of it. You had to deal with multiple enemy bombardments from both sides. You had to fight throughout no man's land, digging trenches just to be able to gain a few miles of ground day by day. The sheer numbers of losses that were occurred from the death toll from not just gunshots, but disease. This novel was definitely a major highlight of that. While it was brief, it was definitely a very vivid picture that it painted. And I will say, the constant flashing back and forth between the Civil War of Krieg and this siege that's taking place definitely painted a grim picture, especially with the similarities of the situation here. Both stories involve a massive weapon of war that could not fall into enemy hands, that was used as a last-ditch effort, and yet having the courage to press that button to unleash something that would be the equivalent of hell on a single planet. That takes a lot of will and sacrifice to take care of. And this novel highlights that choice very well. With all that being said, let's go on to random thoughts here. So, random thoughts here. Was I prepared for this novel? No way. But it was definitely a nice change of pace from the omnibuses, which felt like a long, dragged-out process. So this was definitely a nice, refreshing piece, even if it was extremely grim as a picture, because Colonel Yurden having to choose to make that decision to essentially bomb his homeworld, to wipe the slate clean, to allow them a chance to repent for Krieg. It was a very dark decision for him to make, and it was one that he made when he had almost no other options, when he was essentially down to his last card. And even then, we had a similar situation with Inquisitor Van Bruin, realizing that there was a similar vault hidden under Hive Arathon, with massive weapons of mass destruction from the Dark Age of technology. History was repeating itself here, in this novel, especially for the Krieg. Lord knows how they felt seeing such a similar situation to their own home world, if they even felt anything at all. For the Krieg were mindful of only their duty. They did not care about the fact that they would not be able to live long lives. In fact, there was actually a pretty dark scene of them saying, "We have lived too long. I should be the one to plant the bombs." When they have that choice of who needs to stay behind to detonate it, it isn't really a matter of bravery, it's more of, I've lived too long, it's my time to die. That alone is a very dark thought. And apparently there's more than one novel for the Krieg, which I will be checking out more of, once I, of course, finish all the other ones that I've got stacked up. Oh boy. But I will say Colonel Yurden, he was definitely a character. Defiant, in overwhelming odds, not willing to give up, and only resorting to the super weapons that he had at his disposal as a last resort. And we see him and how this eats at him, the loss of his child, as well as having to destroy his homeworld, and then choosing one of the most difficult decisions, which is to create what they call a Vita womb. Essentially, cloning. The main reason of how the Krieg population constantly rises up with fit and ready soldiers is due to cloning, which apparently is a big no-no amongst the Imperium, but I think in this case they would probably allow it, considering how effective the Krieg are. But more than that, it was interesting, especially seeing how they said they had no citizens on Krieg. They had to spend 500 years sweeping their planet clean, even after launching the nuclear warheads. They had to spend another 500 years, half of a generation, or rather just half a century. They had to spend it clearing up their planet of mutated or rebellious folks who did not want to go down, despite essentially Colonel Yurden winning. But regardless, I wonder if there's any more that features the Octarius War, because one novel that I would want to see from that is Orcs versus Tyranids. I just want to see a massive battle piece between the Orcs and Tyranids. And the Octarius War is seen as a very bloody piece of Imperial history, especially in Warhammer. But regardless, the Krieg were always kept as a mystery. There was actually a chapter where one of the Inquisitor's retinue, an interrogator, tried to get the Krieg to pull off their masks, and they did so, but we don't ever see the aftermath of that. We never really see the Krieg's faces revealed. Nothing. They are kept as a mystery, and for good reason. Okay, I think I've spouted off enough. Let's move on to the overall score. So overall score for Krieg, I'd have to give it a solid 10 out of 10. It was definitely a breath of fresh air after omnibus from Warhammer. It was nice to be able to dive back into one of the smaller novels, and this is in fact one of the smaller ones, at only 296 pages. Very brief, but very refreshing after the omnibuses. So if you guys are interested to check out more of the Astra Militarum novels, this is one that I would recommend for any Warhammer reader. Or if you're just interested to check out more of the Death Korps of Krieg. If you guys have any other Warhammer novels you'd want me to check out in the future, please feel free to let me know. I am up for any kind. But more importantly, if you want to see some of the other Warhammer books that I've talked about in the past, please feel free to go ahead and check it out here. You will not be disappointed, and I promise you, there is a good variety there. More importantly, you guys, thank you so much for listening to this crazy man's ramblings once again. I hope I have continued to entertain you all with some of my crazy rambles or just talking about random books. And if you have any suggestions, throw them at me. I'm more than willing to accept them. And if you liked this video, feel free to leave a like, comment your thoughts on it down below, or subscribe if you're interested for more of what I do. Once again, thank you so much for listening. This is Rambling Collector, signing off. Have a great day, my fellow readers.